We think that Colonel Gaddafi today has lost his mind.
Even by Middle Eastern standards, it's been a week of high drama. It started with Saudi tanks rolling into Bahrain. Then things took another turn on Friday when the United Nations Security Council voted to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya and take whatever measures were needed to protect Libyans from their military rulers, including airstrikes.
This resolution demands an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council has authorized the use of force, including enforcement of a no-fly zone.
Unfortunately, the age or era of cheap oil is now behind us. We have to accept and understand we live in a new energy reality. And the events in the last 2 months in the Arabian Gulf particularly only serve to reinforce that new reality.
So when you start counting the number of barrels that are at stake in this particular region of the world, you know, when the market is in doubt, it only does one thing, it buys.
Earlier in the week, Muammar Gaddafi's regime was trying to convince foreign oil companies that it will soon be safe to start drilling again in Libya. But those reassurances are now worthless, with a coalition of Western and Arab powers effectively on a war footing against the military regime.
Our view is that the Libya situation is going to take some time to resolve, and the concerns that we have and the financial markets have is whether or not this spreads to other countries beyond Egypt and Tunisia, which we've seen already. And if it does affect some of the larger OPEC producers, then it is a serious problem globally.
And just as Libya remains highly volatile, it's still anyone's guess how events in Bahrain will unfold.
Saudi military intervention in Bahrain brings into play the unfortunate possibility that Saudi Arabia and Iran are now on a collision course to military conflict.
Market analyst Jonathan Payne lived in Bahrain for 9 years and has studied the Middle East for a quarter of a century. He says the Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia's intervention in Bahrain is a game changer and raises the question of whether Shiite nations will now strike back. However, Jonathan Payne doesn't think the most powerful Shiite nation, Iran, will commit troops on the ground.
The primary point of leverage that the Iranians have is, of course, to create a potential blockade in the Straits of Hormuz to the south of the Arabian Gulf. And we should be ever mindful of the reality that 20% of the world's oil supply travels daily through the Straits of Hormuz.
The unrest in a growing number of Middle East and African flashpoints isn't just tearing at the social and political fabric of those nations. It's also causing upheaval on energy markets, with the price of crude oil spiking from $93 a barrel at the start of the year to more than $115 last week.
Our fundamental analysis indicates that the oil price should be around $85 a barrel based on looking at the fundamentals of supply, demand, and inventories. But you've now got this added Middle East risk premium that we think is adding $15 to $20 a barrel.
The question now is how high oil prices will go and what that could mean for global economic growth. Even before the United Nations voted to impose a no-fly zone over Libya, some analysts were forecasting oil prices above $150 a barrel.
I think that kind of prediction is very realistic in the short to medium term. However, as soon as we get to those levels, you'd see some commensurate demand destruction, because obviously people wouldn't be able to spend so much money on fuel, petrol, etc., etc.
We're in a situation where obviously the so-called advanced economies are basically muddling through and recovering more recently. Could their threshold of pain be at 150 like it was last time? No, we think it'll probably be lower, in the area of $120 before you have an impact on activity.
While demand for oil in fragile Western economies might be hit hard as prices climb, it's likely to be more resilient in developing nations. Last year, China's oil consumption grew by nearly 12%, Russia by 7%, and South America 5.5%.
We're looking at a situation where, in order to balance the market, we're looking at this market relying more and more on the marginal barrel provided by OPEC, which in the end is a cartel. So, from our point of view, this combination leads to directionally a higher trend in prices over the next 5 years.
I guess the issue is if the Saudis or Iran or some of the larger producers within OPEC get affected, then it does become more of a problem. At the moment, there's spare capacity within OPEC, mainly in Saudi Arabia, but also in some of the other countries that are making up the difference for Libya. So there's no physical supply shortage at the moment.
And although Australian businesses and consumers can now expect to start paying much more for fuel, Gordon Ramsay says the tensions in the Middle East are at least good for local oil explorers and producers.
LNG certainly looks attractive if we jump to the situation in Japan and what that means potentially for LNG prices going forward. But in terms of the producers here, we don't think the market's factoring in a $105 oil price into valuations in the stocks here. So we think that from a longer-term perspective, they're attractive.
But whatever the outcome is in the Middle East, the current crisis reaffirms for some the urgent need for both developed and developing economies to seek out new energy sources.
Because we can no longer be held hostage to the most geopolitically volatile region on planet Earth, which happens to be host or home to 2/3 of the proven oil reserves in the world.
But for now, the oil market and the global economy remain at the whim of some highly volatile forces.